here tonight. I want to tell you a little bit about Constitutionally Speaking. It's a collaborative initiative inviting the public, teachers, and students to consider and thoughtfully discuss our rights and responsibilities as citizens. Now in its second season, this year's project features a sold-out evening with Justices Sandra Day O'Connor and David Souter, a public symposium at UNH School of Law, an interscholastic student conference, and a series of professional development workshops for K through 12 teachers. The final event will be held in May, and details will be announced soon. Please be sure to check the Constitutionally Speaking website for that. Joining us tonight are Attorney James Bopp, Dr. Tony Corrado, and Dr. Shep Melnick, who will be providing us with the opportunity to examine the topic of campaign finance and election reform. No better place for that than here. Dr. Shep Melnick is the Thomas P. Tip O'Neill Junior Professor of American Politics at Boston College, and he teaches a variety of courses on American politics, including courts and public policy, ideas and institutions in American politics, bureaucracy, democracy in America, Rights in Conflict, and the American Politics Graduate Field Seminar. He serves as co-chair of the Harvard Program on Constitutional Government. His research and writing focuses on the intersection of law and politics, and he has authored 2 books, and his current project examines how the Rehnquist Court is reshaping our government institutions. Please join me in welcoming tonight's moderator, Dr. Shep Melnick.
Thanks, Bill. It's a real pleasure to be here in this great facility. I live in Amherst, so I get a chance to come to events here often, and I just want to thank St. Anselm's for putting together such wonderful programs. I also want to thank the audience for sticking with us after this long delay. Unfortunately, one of our commentators, Ray LaRaja from UMass Amherst, is sick with the flu. But we will have 2 wonderful experts on campaign finance. I also want to take this opportunity to thank Ann Kamen, who has organized this not once but twice and really kept us going. It's probably fair to say that few issues excite as much passion as campaign finance. To many people, including I'm sure some people in this audience, the constant flow of money into politics represents a fundamental defect and attack on our political system. According to the well-known phrase, many people believe we have the best Congress money can buy, and it's getting worse. This apocalyptic view of campaign finance has been presented by Larry Lessig and many others. To other people, though, efforts to restrict campaign contributions are both futile and a violation of a right to free speech. Banning various forms of political ads will inevitably lead to a slippery slope that will seriously diminish our First Amendment rights. The only winners would be incumbents who will face less electoral competition. Is it possible to make elections more fair without threatening the First Amendment? Is it possible to reduce the amount of money in politics without producing unintended consequences? These are some of the questions we'll be looking at tonight. And to help us do so, we have 2 really outstanding experts on the topic. The process I'll run through here is I will introduce our first speaker, Mr. James Bopp, and then he will speak. I will then introduce our second speaker, Anthony Corrado, and he will speak. We will then have a brief, about a 20 or 30 minute exchange among the panelists, and then we'll throw it open to questions. So let me start by introducing James Bopp Jr., who is an attorney with the Bopp Law Firm in Terre Haute, Indiana. Mr. Bopp has participated in over 150 campaign finance cases challenging federal law and the laws of 35 states. He's won an impressive 9 campaign finance cases in the Supreme Court. These include the Republican Party of Minnesota versus White on judicial elections, Randall versus Sorrell, which struck down campaign finance limitations in Vermont, and 3 cases on the McCain-Feingold law, most notably Citizens United. In 2013, the National Law Journal named him one of the 100 most influential lawyers in America. Roll Call magazine described him as the preeminent election law attorney for conservative groups, and last year Reuters referred to him as one of the handful of lawyers who dominate the United States Supreme Court docket. Mr. Bopp has also written a number of law review articles on election law and the First Amendment. In 1987, Congress appointed him to its Biomedical Ethics Advisory Committee, and from 2008 to 2012, he served as vice chair of the Republican National Committee. So we are delighted that Mr. Bopp has taken time out of his hectic schedule to speak with us tonight.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all very much for coming the second time. I realize that I'm one of the few people that have come here from out of state that are not running for president of the United States. So you know, when you're used to those kind of luminaries, I really appreciate your passion and interest in this subject, and we all certainly hope that we can help you at least understand our position about how our democracy should be protected and the role that campaign finance and the First Amendment plays in that effort. You know, when I talk about this subject, I do like to start with the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or the right of the people to assemble and to petition their government. There are four indispensable freedoms in that amendment. There's actually two parts, one protecting religion, the other protecting what the court has called the four indispensable democratic freedoms that are necessary for the people to be able to participate in their own government. Because at the founding of our country, really for the first time in the history of the world, we had a different idea about how the government was to be organized. All the other governments were organized top-down. The government was to tell the people, you know, what freedoms they would have or regulate them as they choose, sometimes for the good of the people, sometimes just to loot them for the benefit of the elites, more often the second, to loot them. But our concept was bottom up. That is, that we were engaged in self-government and that we were to elect representatives of us to then temporarily hold limited government power for, you know, the advancement of the common good. It's a completely different concept. That made the First Amendment the most radical campaign finance law in the history of the world. Because instead of the government telling the citizens when and if they can participate in their government, the Constitution deprived the government of the ability to regulate the participation of citizens in their own government. Now, I understand that both incumbent politicians and you know, some of the media, other people with different ideas about this have trouble with the word no. You know, my children growing up, my daughters, 3 daughters, you know, when they were teenagers, they used to think the word no meant, well, it's okay this time, Dad, right? No. The framers really did have a concept of that they were depriving the government of power to do something. Congress shall make no law. Think of those words. Let's say they really wanted to prevent Congress from making no law. What would they have said? Congress shall really, really, really not make any laws. What would they have said? Other than Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech and of the press, the right of the people to petition their government for redress of grievances. And I skipped assemble. Well, that was the idea. And that understanding really has been our law up until recently. Now, that doesn't mean that Congress or the states haven't tried to regulate speech or the press or assembly or petition, because they have. That's why it was put in the First Amendment, is that the founders, being the most sophisticated group of political thinkers and successful politicians, probably in the history of the world, having defeated the ranking and superpower and liberating the country, they understood if they permitted government to have the power to regulate the participation of citizens in their government, they would. And they would first to benefit themselves. You know, the people that are in favor of campaign finance reform spend a lot of time trashing Congress. They're just corrupt, they're, special interests, run the show, they're available for the highest bidder. But at the same time, these same people want these congressmen that are so corrupt to write the laws on your participation in our government or in our campaigns for elected office. Now, what is more important to a member of Congress than their own reelection? Hard to think of something, So if you permit them to write the rules, what do you expect? They're going to write the rules to benefit themselves. Now, if they can get enough people together in Congress, they'll also write the rules for partisan advantage. And this often happens. One party or the other thinks that, well, if we abolish 527s, which was the cause célèbre here, 10 or 12 years ago. If we abolish 527s, first, the Democrats thought it would help them. I started the first 527 in 2000. We got sued by the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee for this outrageously unlawful act, which we won, suit we won. And then before you know it, after the 2004 election, it was the Republicans thinking, well, we got to outlaw 527s. And then, of course, what happened in the next election? The swift boats came along, and probably the most successful 527 in influencing an election. But, they'll use it for partisan gain. Look, they can't help it. They're human. This is understandable. But that doesn't mean we should permit it. It's too important to permit. And that's, of course, the things that end up in the Constitution. In terms of depriving the government of power, are things that are too important to leave to Congress or the president to decide. Rights that we as people have, not because they gave it to us, the government, but because we're endowed by our Creator with it. It precedes the government. So, we end up with important things in the Bill of Rights. Also in part because, the framers understand that things like that can become popular. There have been polls on the Bill of Rights. There's been plenty of times in the history of our country that, but for the 14th Amendment, there would be no protection for the rights of blacks in our country. Forget about it. If it was just up to the public to decide by vote or by popular preference. That's why they put it in the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, to deprive the government of power that they knew that if they gave the government the power, then there would be times, and maybe a lot of times, when it would be exercised against the people that they want to protect. So that's exactly why the First Amendment is in the Constitution, and that is the force that it has. Now, that doesn't mean that incumbents haven't been trying to protect themselves from you people. It wasn't a few years until the 1790s when Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Act. These were the Federalists, John Adams and the Federalists, who dominated Congress, that passed the Alien and Sedition Act that said that it was a federal crime if you disparaged the government, if you criticized it, the government, or a public official like your congressman, you know, saying they voted wrong, that they shouldn't have done that that's bad. Disparage the government, disparage a public official. People got prosecuted and convicted for criticizing members of the federal government under that law. Well, why did they do this? Well, it was simple. Here's the Federalists with now the emerging Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson. What are they going to do, okay, to maintain their power? Well, they're going to pass a law. That's what they're going to do. They have the power. They're going to pass a law and stop the Republicans from disparaging the Federalists. Well, it didn't work. People went to jail, but it didn't work because in 1800, the Republicans of Thomas Jefferson, he won the presidency, the Republicans swept Congress, they repealed the Alien and Sedition Act. Jefferson pardoned all those convicted under it. And that was it. That was it really for over a century, till 1918, when the Congress passed in 1918 the Sedition Act. And this was just like the first one, the Alien and Sedition Act, which you can't disparage the government or it's a federal crime. Well, what they were trying to do at that time was they were concerned about the communist revolution in Russia. They did not want that to be exported to the United States, and they thought, well, the way to stop this from happening is to shut up everybody who's a communist that wants to talk about and criticize the government. So we're going to pass a law and throw them in jail if they criticize the government. Well, that didn't last long, fortunately. Fast forward to 1974, the post-Watergate amendments to the Federal Election Campaign Act. Absolutely the most comprehensive limitation on the participation and activities of anybody and everybody in the political system. Political parties, candidates, independent groups, not-for-profits, and individuals. Everybody was affected by the limits, and what they used were both contribution and expenditure limits. In that law, for instance, let me give you an example. A candidate for President of the United States was limited to spending $20 million. It wasn't even indexed for inflation. $20 million. In the last election, both candidates spent, well, one spent more than $1 billion, one spent almost $1 billion of their own campaign funds to run for president. If that law hadn't been struck down by the Supreme Court, they'd have been limited to $20 million. Well, many of those restrictions were struck down except for contribution limits. And they, $1,000 contribution to a candidate, $5,000 to a PAC, that stayed at that amount for several decades, not indexed for inflation until McCain-Feingold was passed in 2002, was raised, and now it's $2,700 for contribution to a candidate. Supreme Court did not strike down contribution limits, and they are the source of all the distortions that everybody complains about in our political system, our campaign system. We wouldn't have to worry about corporations that are permitted, or labor unions under Citizens United, to advocate the election or defeat of a candidate if people could give money to the candidate. You know, $2,700 is a lot for me, it's a lot for a lot of people, but in the grand scheme of things, last presidential election, Democrat supporting super PACs that have no contribution limits raised $220 million. Republicans supporting super PACs raised $140 million. You notice Democrats got more. I'll be back to that. And because there's no contribution limits. Why are they giving this money to these PACs? Why are they doing this? Because you can't give it to the candidate. Pretend that you are a trial lawyer, and every year you make millions with punitive damage awards and class action lawsuits. You make several $1,000,000 a year because you're a successful lawyer getting punitive damages against these corporations that are doing bad things and injuring people. And let's say the Republican legislature comes along, because this has been the Republicans' idea mainly, comes along and says, okay, well, we're going to limit punitive damages. Well, and you're this trial lawyer. How much is that worth to you? $100,000? $500,000? $1,000,000? I don't know. I'm not one of them. But it's worth more than $2,700, I'll flat guarantee you. So, here's the trial lawyer. It's worth $50,000 to me to try to influence by electing Democrat politicians who are not going to vote for punitive damages be imposed upon me in my practice. But I can only give if they're federal candidates, only $2,700. Do you think that trial lawyer gives a couple of candidates $2,700 and then just puts the other, let's say, $42,000 in his bank account and walks home? Hell no. He looks around and he says, how can I spend that money to influence who gets elected? Well, wait a second, there's a political committee, there's a political party over here. Well, I can give something to there. Well, if it's a state party, it's limited to $10,000. I still got $32,000, okay? The trial lawyers have a PAC. I can give money to that. $5,000 is all I can give to that. Okay, now I'm down to $27,000. Well, what about this super PAC over here of super trial lawyers that are going to go after them? Bingo, $27,000, off it goes to the super PAC. Or it could have gone to a 527, or it could have gone to a C4, or it could have gone to an LLC that participates in politics. It could have gone to an exploratory committee or a draft committee. I mean, there are also all of these different organizations that campaign finance recognizes for different functions, and you look around to spend the money that you think, it's a supply and demand, calculation. How much of this? How bad is this going to hurt me? Therefore, how much am I willing to spend to try to prevent getting hurt? And then how do I do it? Well, if you could give that, if you could have given $50,000 to his congressman, do you think he would have been given money to the super PAC, or the trial lawyer PAC, or the trial lawyer C4, or the 527 over here, or this labor union? Maybe, maybe not, but probably a lot not, because it makes no sense. The money that is spent most effectively and efficiently is by the candidate, him or herself. Everybody knows this. So, that's what you would do. Well, but you can't. So we have this proliferation of organizations. We're right in the beginning of a presidential primary season, as you all know, are acutely aware already of. Well, these candidates have multiple organizations now supporting their campaign. They have super PACs, they have C4s, they have 527s, they have leadership PACs, one has an exploratory committee, they could have a draft committee. It's all because of contribution limits. They can only take $2,700. So they want to wait to be a candidate to raise money at that amount because those dollars are so precious, because they're so restricted. So they're out there multiplying organizations like jackrabbits and raising unlimited sums into these organizations. And do any of you actually think you're going to ever know anything about this? No. No transparency because it's just too complicated. Too many rabbit holes. You'll never know. And you won't know who either. Now that all assumes if you care. Frankly, few people care. But if you cared, will you ever know? No, because some of them don't report at all. Some of them report only partially. Some report a lot. But you also have to know which one. Which is everybody that knows the super PAC that is supporting Rick Perry, who was here this weekend, knows the name of it. Raise your hand. Nobody. I don't know it. And I'm helping a candidate for president. I don't know the name of it. So, no transparency. And how about accountability? Can you vote against a super PAC? No. Can you vote against a 527? Can you vote against a C4? No. Can you vote against a leadership PAC? Yeah, it's getting a little closer because the candidate's involved in that. So the candidate could be, you could say he's responsible. Well, but you know for sure that he's responsible for his own campaign committee. So where's the accountability? It's out the window. Let's say the candidate for president, or let's talk Senate. Let's say a candidate for Senate in Kentucky receives money from the tobacco industry. What do you think that means when he runs in Kentucky? They love him. This is good. That means he's for us, that he's with the tobacco companies. New Hampshire, probably not so much. Probably bad. But what happens if the tobacco company gives to a super PAC? You going to vote against a candidate because a tobacco company gave money to a super PAC? Or to a 527 or a C4, which you'll never know. See? Lack of transparency and accountability, all out the window. Why? Contribution limits. All of this complaining and moaning and groaning about 527, C4s, super PACs, dark money, one of the big lies of the current campaign season, dark money. And why? Why do these groups even exist? Because of contribution limits to the candidate. If they could take the money, they could be held responsible for it. You could vote for or against them because they got it. And they can't hide from it. Now they can hide from it like mad. And they will. Because they have to. Because they can't take it themselves. So that is what modern campaign finance reform has given us. An unresponsive, unaccountable, non-transparent system. That's what it's given us. You can't hold a candidate into account because he's supported by the special interest you hate because he didn't get the money. So you can just go away and around and talk to each other and say, well, the money went over to that C4 over there. People's eyes glaze over, and it doesn't mean anything to anybody, except for very few people that are intimately involved in all this. They don't understand what that means. So this is the reality of our current system. And of course, the campaign finance reformers spend all of their time trying to, playing knock-a-mole. The mole pops up in here and you knock it down, and then big go up, the mole comes here and you knock it down. And, one of my jobs is creating these mole holes. And it's not that hard, honestly. All the mole holes that could be created haven't yet been created. But I've already thought of them. And they will be created. I flat guarantee you, if there are restrictions on even the ones we have now, and we may have to have more just because the money that's required to run. So welcome to the world of campaign finance reform. Unresponsive, unaccountable, untransparent. You want to follow the money? Forget it. Forget it. Well, so there is a solution, and the solution is freedom. The solution, I wake up in the morning and sometimes I think, if I'm really cynical, I say, we really need to have contribution limits. Now, but I know the current ones are too low. Well, why do I know that? Because the justification for contribution limits is that it's a large contribution that you can exchange, that you have a quid pro quo exchange that's at least implied, or there's a danger of it occurring because the size of the contribution is so large that it's just kind of inherent in it. Nobody would give, $5 million to somebody without thinking that there's going to be something in exchange. It may not be actually corrupt. It may be, we'll let you sleep in the Lincoln bedroom like Clinton did. Well, big deal, You can probably sleep in the Lincoln bedroom for a lot less than $5 million. I think the going rate was $100,000 in the Clinton administration. Well, so it's not corruption, but it's the concern about it. Well, you cannot even buy a Democrat congressman for $2,700. The anecdotal evidence is it takes $99,000 in cold hard cash to bribe a Democrat congressman. That is Congressman William Jefferson of New Orleans, who was convicted after they found $99,000 in cash in his freezer in his house. Now, apparently Republicans go for more. Duke Cunningham, he was the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. You came in and you wanted an earmark for a weapons system, he would literally pull out of his desk a schedule. Okay, how much did you say this was for? Oh, $50 million? Okay, that will be his lowest, which was $140,000. You want a $50 million earmark, that's $140,000, and it went up from there. 140 was the least. So we know for sure that it takes at least 6 figures to actually bribe somebody. And I think, the average congressman, it'd be a lot more. I know a lot of these people. They are not corrupt. That you listen to the reformers, you think they're all corrupt. And in fact, they could be bought for $100. A lot of them talk like that. But they're not that way. And in fact, it's less so than it has been because they're more ideological than they have been in the past. So it's much more difficult to corruptly influence a congressman than it used to be. But this amount is so wildly low from the amount that it would actually take that it's absurd. Well, so at least, even when I wake up, all depressed about our future, at least we should raise contribution limits to like $100,000. Oh my God, $100,000. There are, 20 states that you can contribute up to that amount or more. In Indiana, you can contribute anything to a candidate for state office, anything. You can contribute $1 billion if you want. And when you look at the ratings of, corrupt states and well-governed states, and what you find is no relationship between contribution limits and rigorous campaign finance restrictions and whether they're considered well-governed or corrupt. It's about half and half, Some of the most corrupt states have the most rigorous limits. The studies demonstrate that it makes no difference and has no relationship to anything. And now, other times I wake up and I'm more optimistic and I say, well, it seems to work okay in Indiana. We don't have any particular, big problem. I know, a guy, state rep yesterday or the day before has been texting to a prostitute, but a porn star, but, that at least didn't involve campaign cash. And so I say, well, let the voters decide. Every year there's an article, and this article for the governor's race, every year there's one article, and that one article goes to the largest contributors to each candidate and asks them why they gave the money. Every year, the Indianapolis Star, every 4 years, the Indianapolis Star does this one article, and that's it. And they answer, and they'll say who they are, and what they've been involved in, or and try to ferret out if there's some interest. Usually, they find there isn't, any reason for them to do this other than that they, conservative, and the guy is run as a conservative or a liberal and whatever, and they, not something specific, that they're going to get more Pizza Hut or something, like one big contributor that I'm familiar with. Let the voters decide. And if you let them take the money, you can then hold them accountable. And it may be, you may view the money coming from the trial lawyers to the Democrat candidate as a good thing. Then you can be rest assured that they think he's in favor of what I think about personal injury cases, because the trial lawyers have vetted him and have decided he believes in what they believe in. And if you don't like trial lawyers, you can say, this guy's in the pocket of the trial lawyers. In other words, he believes what they believe, not that he's been bought and paid for, but he believes it, and so I'll vote against him. Accountable, everybody knows what's going on, we can deal with it. So that's the state of campaign finance, and that's what happens when you don't obey the no. I mean, people get in trouble when they do things that they ought not to do. Bad things happen when you violate the no. It's just inevitable. And of course, that's exactly where we are in the state of our country. And you can lament it and try to go after each of these manifestations, these corporations or unions or whoever you want to go after and complain about them all day long, but it's not going to change unless you raise contribution limits. You have caused the problem, and you are suffering the consequences, and it's unavoidable. So that's the state of campaign finance, and the founders had it right. They understood that if you let the government do this, then that they were going to pass rules to benefit themselves or do it on a partisan basis if possible. But what is this would be the certain result is your participation in our political system is going to be reduced. And all of that has come to pass because they knew incumbents would never obey the word no, but unfortunately the Supreme Court once or twice has not recognized and obeyed the word no. And so we are where we are, but it needs to change, and it will. Thank you.
Our second speaker is Professor Anthony Corrado from Department of Government at Colby College. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. I'm proud to say that Tony received his PhD in political science from my department at Boston College. And he didn't put it on his resume, but Tony recently was recognized by our department as its most distinguished graduate in the history of our PhD program. He's written and edited more books and articles about campaign finance than I could possibly mention here. And I think it's fair to say that he's the political science profession's leading expert on campaign finance. He's recognized and respected by all parties in this dispute. For many years, he served as a member and then as chair and as an advisor to the American Bar Association's Standing Committee on Election Law. He has participated in a number of Supreme Court cases, despite the fact that he isn't a lawyer. He served as an expert consultant in some cases, helped to write amicus briefs in others. He just told me that he doesn't think he's been nearly as successful as Jim in that litigation. I assume that they've been on the opposite sides of many of those cases. I've spoken with Tony about campaign finance on many occasions, and I've always been impressed by his fairness and balance, and really overwhelmed by the extent of his knowledge. So we're glad to have Tony here.
Thank you, Shep. And I'd like to thank Neil and Ann for inviting me to join you here this evening. You have to understand from my perspective at this time of year, it's always nice to travel south and get to someplace warm. You know, when you come from a place where a substantial portion of the population of Canada is south of you, Manchester is pretty good at this time of the year. I want to talk a little bit about the complexities of campaign finance, and as you see, Jim always raises a number of provocative issues. It's certainly the case that there are debates to be had on these matters, and I'm sure we'll get to them this evening, but I think perhaps before we do that, I want to kind of take a little different tact and look at some of the changes that have taken place just in recent years in the campaign finance system. As Jim noted, there are a lot of rabbit holes. As Jim noted, there's lots of efforts underway to try to avoid not simply contribution limits, but even such simple requisites as public disclosure of campaign money. And more we see today, you know, lots of controversy and talk about this, but what I find generally is people wonder, how did we get here? And for the most part, we got here because we've undergone an enormous number of changes in the last 5 years. The elections of 2012, the elections of 2016 are financed in a way that were dramatically different from what we saw even back you know, in 2008 or 2006. So I thought tonight I'd begin by talking just a bit about some of the key developments so that you can see how we got to where we are. How do we get down this path? Because I think that there's been a substantial transformation in the system over the course of the last few years. That what we have done is move to a system where generally it's the case that we have enhanced the role of a very elite group of wealthy donors and their influence in the political process. That we have exacerbated the problem of undisclosed money in our elections, and that we see more and more of it flowing into elections these days. And that we've given rise, as Jim notes, to an array of so-called independent groups that take many forms that, for the most part, are now allowed to freely raise and spend money to support the candidates that are their preference. And in my view, one of the results of this is that we have significantly increased the influence of a very small elite of individuals in this country. And we have undermined the accountability and transparency of the system. But I don't think that that's necessarily all due to the fact that we have contribution limits, which the courts have upheld time and time again, or that it's due to disclosure rules because the courts have upheld them time and time again. The story is more complex. A lot of it has to do with regulatory actions, as well as the parsing of laws by political operatives, as well as some recent court decisions. So I thought it might be good just to take a few minutes to review some of the key developments. I can't possibly begin to even cover all of the major developments in the last 5 years because they become so fast and furious, it's almost hard to keep up. But I can, I guess, shed some light on, in a way, some of the, what I see as absurdities that we have now come to, or at least, you know, some of the actions that show that even in the area of campaign finance law, you know, things are not working as they should. I guess most observers would say that, Citizens United was the signal event that kind of heralds in this era of modern campaign finance in terms of these recent developments I'm talking about. And as you all know, this was the first time, this decision in which the court basically held that corporations had the same right under the First Amendment to spend money independently as individuals, parties, or political action committees and other entities. And this was certainly an important case, but my general view is that it hasn't been as consequential as many often assume it to be. That for the most part, before the Citizens United decision, there were ways that corporations and labor unions could spend money in connection with federal elections. That for the most part, what they were prohibited from doing was actually spending money to expressly advocate the election or defeat of a candidate, and that Citizens United essentially gave them that ability to do so. So to that extent, it made this money more useful in some ways in elections, and it certainly resolved any questions about the legality of the use of corporate and union funds. But in my view, there were other cases that were more important. Most importantly, the court decision that was a district court decision in a case called SpeechNow versus Federal Election Commission. SpeechNow.org was a political committee, and they wanted to make independent expenditures. In fact, they specifically said, we only want to make independent expenditures in campaigns. We have no intention whatsoever of making contributions to candidates. And consequently, they challenged the constitutionality of the contribution limits that they had to operate under and the disclosure rules that they were required to abide by as a political committee. Up to this point, any group of individuals acting as a political committee could make unlimited independent expenditures. As Jim would tell you, that was a basic assumption made in the Buckley case in 1976, that the court basically took the doctrinal assumption that money spent independently does not pose a risk of corruption because there's no direct exchange with a candidate, and therefore independent expenditures should not be limited in their amounts. But the court did note that the amounts of money raised had to come from limited contributions, and that had been the law until we got to SpeechNow. These groups could spend all the money they want as long as they raised it from individuals in amounts of $5,000 a year or less, $5,000 per year. The court struck down the contribution limit and basically said, following this notion that independent expenditures pose no risk of corruption, that there was therefore no justification for a contribution limit on the monies raised by SpeechNow. This gave rise to what federal election law considers the independent expenditure only multi-candidate non-connected political committee. Now, that's a mouthful, and no one could come up with a good acronym, so they started calling them super PACs, okay? These are political committees that, as you now know, can raise unlimited amounts from any permissible source and spend unlimited amounts. The general assumption of the court was that these would be wholly independent of the candidates, that these would be independent activities. But the lines quickly began to blur. You soon saw the rise of super PACs that were established not only by independent groups, but by party operatives, former party staff, former campaign staff, former political staff of members of Congress, including two super PACs set up by former staff and political associates of the House and Senate Democratic leadership who thought that they would get in on this. By 2011, these so-called independent committees had quickly given rise to the single candidate super PAC, a super PAC set up only for one candidate to support a candidate in one specific election, and thus basically operate as a parallel campaign organization. As you know, in 2012, these PACs played a prominent role in the presidential election. Those of you in New Hampshire may have seen one or two campaign ads at about this time 3 years ago. And they played a major role in the key congressional races in 2014. So we then moved to the single candidate PAC. The actions were facilitated by the Federal Election Commission, which essentially is the agency responsible for regulating federal campaign finance law, who basically ruled that these committees need not be wholly independent of the candidates. In fact, the FEC said that candidates could attend super PAC events. Candidates could be the featured guest at a super PAC event or fundraiser. Candidates could speak at super PAC events. They could engage in other interactions with super PACs and their donors. The one thing they couldn't do is ask for the money. They could ask for a contribution, but it had to be in conformity with contribution limits. But as you know, at any fundraiser, the candidate typically isn't the one asking for the money. That's why we made staff. They ask for the money, and the candidate comes and appears, takes photos with everyone, meets and greets, and moves on. So essentially, these PACs now operate fundraisers essentially like all other campaign fundraisers. So they're not wholly independent. What's more, the premise of the Speech Now case was that the committee specifically said we have no intention to make contributions to candidates, so we're not going to be involved directly with the candidates. But that proviso also went out the window. The Federal Election Commission agreed in response to some litigation that a super PAC could be just like a traditional PAC and make contributions to candidates as long as they had a separate bank account and raised regulated contributions for that bank account. They could be both. They could be kind of a traditional PAC and make contributions to candidates, and be a super PAC and take unlimited money to spend on independent expenditures, which gave rise to what I like to call the hybrid PAC, right? Or conversely, a traditional PAC could now just set up a bank account for its independent expenditures, take unlimited money from any permissible source, and make the independent expenditures out of that pool of money. So that as a result, what we saw was, the rise of this new entity. Now, the Speech Now decision, the court strictly upheld disclosure rules. They were challenged, and the court said, no, the monies you raise and spend on independent expenditures have to be fully disclosed to the public. In the Citizens United case, the court strongly upheld disclosure laws. In fact, the court voted 8-1 to uphold disclosure rules and said that, all the monies that a corporation may spend independently have to be disclosed to the public. In fact, Justice Kennedy in the majority opinion said that for the first time, corporate spending in elections is permitted and will be fully disclosed. The majority opinion went on to say, disclosure permits citizens and shareholders to react to the speech of corporate entities in a proper way. The transparency enables the electorate to make informed decisions and give proper weight to different speakers and messages. Time and time again, ever since the Buckley decision, the court has made clear that one of the things that safeguards the election process from corruption is full and complete public disclosure. And what we found was that it was soon the case that we weren't getting full disclosure. Many of these super PACs decided to start to align themselves with tax-exempt organizations, what are known in tax law as 501c4 organizations, basically public policy advocacy organizations or other organizations that are offering one major advantage. They are not required to fully disclose their funds or receipts and expenditures under the law. They're only required to report monies that they spend on something like an independent expenditure expressly supporting a candidate or an election communication, a broadcast advertisement featuring a candidate close to an election. But they're required to report what they spend on those items. In particular, the law says that if you make an electioneering communication and you spend $10,000 in a calendar year, you're required to disclose the amounts of money you spent on these items, and you're responsible for reporting each donor who gave $1,000 or more. And the idea was to make sure that if these committees were going to engage in the types of advocacy that is considered election advocacy, that they be accountable for the monies they raised and spent. But by aligning with these 501c4s, there are plenty of ways that they can spend money without having to report it. There's many activities they can fund in connection with an election that is not disclosed, so that the basic purpose was to give donors an option. You can give to the super PAC, but we will report your contribution to the public. Or you can give to this friendly neighborhood tax-exempt organization, and your contribution will not be disclosed. Basically giving them the option of hiding the donations from public view. What surprised me the most was that even this modest disclosure requirement, the Federal Election Commission managed to undermine. Because it seemed to me the law was pretty clear. What the FEC decided was that they would adopt regulations that said that a disclosure would only be required if a donor made a contribution for the specific purpose of funding an advertisement. So that if I gave a contribution saying, Kayla, here's a contribution, will you please use this to finance $100,000 in advertising, against Shep Melnick, then I had to report that contribution. But if I just said, Kayla, here's $100,000, really support what you're doing, go help those guys win, then it didn't have to be disclosed. In fact, the 3 Republican commissioners expressed the view that unless the contribution was given for a specific independent expenditure, it did not have to be disclosed. So that made it pretty easy to avoid disclosure. Just give the money, don't specify the laundry list of what you wanted it to pay for. And given the fact that most of these groups tend to raise the money before they make the campaign ads, or tend to raise the money before they really have their campaign strategy, you're pretty safe in not disclosing the contributions. So consequently, we created this new black hole. More recently, what we have seen are changes that have substantially increased contribution limits, or at least ease some of the restrictions that previously existed on contribution limits, particularly with respect to the amounts that can be given to candidates, parties, and political committees within the system. One change in this regard was that prior to 2014, federal law not only limited how much you can give to candidates, as Jim noted, currently $2,700 per election, which means $2,700 in a primary and $2,700 in a general election. And it also placed a cap on the total amount, the aggregate amount any one individual could give. The general thinking was that, one of the ways to safeguard against corruption in the political system was to limit how much any one individual can give in total, okay? And the amount was substantial, at least from the, Colby College professor view of things. The trial lawyers Jim has to go against have other perspectives, I'm sure. But generally, the law, which was adopted as a result of McCain-Feingold and increased the contribution limits then and indexed many of them to inflation, said in 2014 you can give a total of $123,400. And that amount basically represented you can give $48,000 to candidates and then the rest to parties or political action committees. Well, the court, now, this is not a limit that was restricting the speech of many Americans, okay? In fact, if you look in 2012, there were 646 donors who reached this threshold. If you want to be more generous and say, well, how many people, gave 95,000 or more, we're talking about 1,777 donors. If you want to be even more generous and say, well, what about just parties and the people who reach the maximum for parties? You're talking about 1,800 donors. So, let's say there are 2,000 people in America that are affected by this. If you look at this, what you find is that last year, in the court case of McCutcheon versus the Federal Election Commission, the Supreme Court threw out the aggregate limit saying that the specific limits imposed on candidates or parties was enough to safeguard against corruption. So that consequently now, these individuals can give in aggregate as much as they would like under the specific contribution limits. Then, more recently, at the end of last year, just to show you, Shep, how you really got to keep up with this stuff, Congress passed an omnibus bill at the end of the year as they were in their normal budgeting process, something, frankly, that Professor Corrado usually doesn't pay much attention to, except this time, you know, in this large bill, which totaled 1,603 pages, they slipped in a major change in campaign finance law. You had to read deep to get to it, because it started on page 1599. But those of you who like to read the back of the book first to see what's going to happen and then kind of fill in the details, you caught it a lot more quickly than I did. But the bill basically dramatically increased the amounts that can be given to national party committees, in part by setting up 3 new types of accounts that you could give $97,000 to each year, so that basically creating a system where an individual donor can give more than $300,000 a year to the national party committees now. So that very small group that gives at these levels, you know, has been kind of further empowered. So what have we seen? You know, what are some of the consequences? First, in recent years, we have witnessed a dramatic surge in the amounts of money that are raised and spent by these non-party independent organizations. If you look in recent elections, in 2006, non-party organizations reported election spending of about $68 million in the independent expenditures and other communications that they made. In 2010, this grew to $355 million, including almost $65 million from super PACs. In 2012, this rose in terms of reported spending to $1 billion, including $609 million from super PACs and $257 million from C4 organizations. In 2014, we got it up to a midterm election of, I think it was $550 million at last count, including $348 million from super PACs, 70 million of which came from single candidate super PACs that were basically organized for 10 battleground Senate races. So that's a dramatic shift that we've seen. Second, most of this money comes from a small group of wealthy individuals. For the most part, the money we see come from individuals who are willing to give large amounts for political purposes. If you look since 2010, my last estimate is that there's been somewhere in the area of $1 billion in super PAC funding. 195 individuals and their spouses are responsible for most of that money. They're responsible for about 60% of it, or a little over $600 million. Or if you want another way to think about this, in 2014, the top 100 donors reporting political spending and contributions gave a total of $356 million. $323 million, which was almost as much as the $356 million raised in the entire federal election system through contributions of $200 or less. And there were 4.75 million small contributions of $200 or less, and that's what it took to match just the top 100 donors. And that doesn't include all the money that's not reported. That doesn't include the funding that's not disclosed. So, you know, what you're looking at is, you know, a system where the top of the pyramid has gained extraordinarily outsized influence. And much of this also is hidden from public view. Because of these changes in the rules that the Federal Election Commission has made, and because of the unwillingness of federal regulators largely to, tighten the disclosure rules as we have gone along, what we see now is more of the money that is reported as election spending is not disclosed as far as where the money came from. So I'm not even talking about, the groups that Jim was referencing who don't disclose at all. I'm talking about the people who say, yes, here's how much we spent, but they don't tell you where it came from. In 2006, before these new FEC rules, there was one group that reported election spending and didn't report their donors, and that group was responsible for $600,000. By the time you get to 2010, 1 out of 3 groups that were reporting electioneering communications were not disclosing their donors, and only 9 of the top 30 independent expenditures groups were reporting their donors. So that the best estimates are that you had in 2010 $125 million that was reported as being spent to influence elections and expressly advocate a candidate, but the funding sources were hidden from public view. In 2012, that rose to more than $300 million. In 2014, about $173 million. So substantial amounts of money are now flowing into the system that are not disclosed, which I believe has a significant effect in undermining the accountability and transparency of the system. One more final point, and then we'll get to opening it up here. I would say another aspect worth noting that has become a matter of controversy has been the shift that's taken place in the sources of funding. If Ray were here, one of the points I think that he would make is that there is a debate about whether it is better to have more of the money coming from the political parties or more of the money coming from these independent groups. And there's a great concern that these independent groups, because they tend to advocate particular interests, tend to pose, greater problems for the political system in terms of the influence of these more particular interests rather than what some see as the more collective interest of a party. And if you look, one of the consequences of these changes in law is that we've seen a substantial shift. Most of the money and the vast majority of the money still comes from the candidates. But if you look at the handful of races where the parties spend money and these groups spend money, and this is not equal opportunity political spending. This is not raising hundreds of millions of dollars because we're trying to elect 400 members of the United States House and Senate. We're basically trying to elect 30 or 40 to determine the partisan balance. And the vast majority of this money, for example, if you look at the super PAC money in 2014, 81% went into 10 Senate races, okay? It's basically a battle for partisan control. And as a result, what has happened is that in these races, more and more, you're seeing that these outside groups outspend the candidates by substantial sums. If you look back in 2006, 2008, what you find is that where there was lots of what some people call outside spending in these battleground races, it was largely money from the political parties. And the parties were, in some cases, spending substantial amounts, mostly in the general election campaign. But for the most part, it was still the case that the candidates were responsible for the majority of the funding. If you look now, what you find is more and more we're seeing races, particularly these key contests, where these independent groups and super PACs are outspending the candidates. So that in 2008, there were 5 instances where the groups outspent the candidates. In 2010, 12. In 2012, 32. In 2014, 28 races. So that, one of the concerns that has been expressed is, are we creating a system now where, we're out of balance, and that those more party-oriented types of efforts are now, being overcome at the expense of the advantages that are had by these independent groups, which are advantages I think have largely been caused by the problems of regulators and the unwillingness of Congress to take action to change the laws, which is something I'm certain will come up as we discuss these matters further. But thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
The way we're going to work this, do you hear me okay? Is we're going to, we'll have a conversation up here for about 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll throw it open to questions. I want to start it off by noting that both the speakers paint a pretty dismal picture of campaign finance. It's filled with rabbit holes, lack of disclosure, money is flowing in and none of us know where. I was wondering if you could say something about who the winners and losers are in terms of recipients. We know that the big winners must be experts on campaign finance law who are lawyers and get very well-paying jobs. But how about Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, incumbents, challengers, ideologues, moderates?
That's a really tough question because you know because it has different effects in different places and different times. You know, Tony painted a correct picture about the increasing amount of independent spending, and it's going to continue. And you know, I think you mentioned, which I saw too, like 9 Senate races last time, where the outside spending, I hate that phrase, can I use independent spending? I noticed that, thank you. Independent spending exceeded what the candidates spent. And that, those were the 9 of the most competitive Senate races in the country. And of those races, actually I added it up, and of those 9, only 3 or 4 involved incumbents getting reelected. The rest of them challengers won. And if you measure, so it depends how you look at these situations. If you measure competitiveness by the ability of a challenger to defeat an incumbent, you would say, oh, this is a good deal, you know. Look, in these 9 races, 5 or 6 challengers won the election. That's a healthy situation. And I do think that there has been a certain amount of leveling the playing field. Incumbents have a lot of advantages, and that mean that if you look historically, the reelection rate is like 90, some percent. And so to have these, even though this is not I don't think a usual election, but even to have an election like this where so many got defeated is pretty remarkable, and most people would look at that and say, well, maybe that's a healthy thing. Systematically, what is happening is that the candidate's voice is being reduced systematically, year after year after year. That is what it's going to be worse and worse and worse. If you consider that to be a bad development, which I do, I mean, it is, after all, the candidate that takes office. So, we really ought to, it's a lot better to talk to the person, themselves than to hear, somebody else tell you about them. I mean, this is just human nature. And so that's going to happen, and the reaction in the states have been to raise contribution limits. There's 13 states in the last cycle that raised contribution limits, and they're busy right now doing it in a number of states, raising contribution limits, because they look at this and say, well, wait a second, here, I'm an incumbent, I'm a candidate, I can't compete with the fundraising, and so the way to fix that is to raise contribution limits. And that's a healthy development, but systematically, as I've already mentioned, the reduction in accountability and transparency. But the question you asked is I think there's going to be more of a level of the playing field effect. The incumbents will not have quite as much advantage, but all candidates are going to have their voices reduced.
Generally, what we've seen so far, and I would agree with this, that you know what you're seeing here is more and more speech by those other than the candidate, although it varies. I guess I would say this. First, the general impressions that people had, especially after 2012, was that these were developments that really benefited the Republicans. You know, they tended to focus on the presidential race and see all the money being raised by super PACs on the Republican side, and based on the kind of stereotypical notion that, well, the Republicans must have more millionaires who give them money, and therefore they're going to win in this big money game. What you found was that it wasn't that clear at all. While it was the case that in 2012, the Republican super PACs and other independent committees raised more than the Democratic committees, if you looked at the congressional races, the Democratic groups outspent the Republican groups. And so what you had was kind of in the presidential race, the super PACs balancing Obama's financial advantage over Romney. What you had down in the lower levels in the congressional races was, you know, the Democrats getting a big advantage from these super PACs. Same thing this time around. While it was generally the case that you had a number of very well-funded Republican efforts, there are also, you know, very well-funded Democratic efforts. In fact, the super PACs set up by the House and Senate Democratic leadership, although I recognize legally and technically they were not set up by the House and Senate Democrat. They were independent. They you know, were two of the biggest spending groups active in this election cycle, along with obviously the name everyone knows is American Crossroads and some of the other organizations. But for the most part, what you're seeing now is that, you know, the Democrats are just getting in the game too. Just like the Republicans had the first head start on super PACs, and then quickly we suddenly have Priorities USA and President Obama saying, well, maybe we need a super PAC too. What you now see is that the Democrats are getting more involved. And what's happening now is it's almost a two-tiered problem, right? One tier is you've got groups that are essentially party allies who are forming these committees and are basically going to pursue the same strategies as the party committees, which are the same strategies as the candidates, okay? It's not really the incumbent wins or challenger wins. It's that here are the 10 or 12 races that are the key battlegrounds, and this is where we're all going to go spend money. What's extraordinary about all this effort is that if you look at it from afar in a systematic approach, and you say, gee, you know, here's another $1 billion being put into the election process, right? You could say, Shep, we just had the most expensive midterm in U.S. history. They spent $3.7 billion re-electing Congress. Well, if you look, there are basically, you know, of those 435 congressmen, you know, about 400 who never saw a penny of any of this money. Right? Of the 33 members of the Senate who are up, there are basically about 23 who never saw a penny of this money, because it's all so concentrated. The parties are spending in the same place, so they're not engaging in efforts that I would like to see, which is more expansion of participation, broader civic participation. And what you're going to see, I think, in this next cycle is that both sides will try to raise as much as they can. You know, if you follow the news, which sometimes is hard to do, because if anything is attached to the word Koch brothers, it will get major coverage. If it's not attached to Koch brothers, it doesn't. But if you look what lies beneath, you've got groups like the Democracy Alliance now, which is a group of progressive liberal donors who are pledging a $500 million effort you know, in upcoming elections. A new group was just formed, Patriotic Millionaires, which is a favorite of mine now, Jim. You can use this because, A, I didn't know there were so many unpatriotic millionaires out there. But their goal is to raise, you know, $100 million to go out and advocate tax increases on the wealthy and more taxes on corporations. So they're kind of like a super PAC being formed to convince Congress to tax us more. It's kind of an interesting group. But this is the type of thing you see at one level, where they're kind of aligned with the parties. Then on another level, what you have now are wealthy individuals who just have particular issues they're interested in, who write a check and fund an effort. So for example, Tom Steyer, who basically last cycle wrote $74 million in checks to promote, his effort to make global climate change more of an issue. I expect the checks are going to be much bigger in 2016 for this effort. So that, you've now got it on both sides, and one of the real problems is that you have now a system that gives any individual willing to write a big enough check to go out and, largely create a campaign that a candidate who faces that opposition may not be able to compete against. Which is further intensifying the pressures on members of Congress to raise money, in part because they're all concerned about who's going to come and drop $1 million on me in my next election. And I think that it's become a palpable problem on Capitol Hill.
Mm-hmm. I suppose if we're looking for a silver lining, we can say a lot of that targeted money came to New Hampshire. Since we have so many close races.
I got a feeling that I'm going to be seeing another redecoration and some new carpeting at WMUR this time next year. Okay, I'll go out on a limb on that. Okay.
That actually brings up a question I think probably many people have on their mind, which is about public funding. Because one way of reducing demand for private money is to increase the amount of public money, maybe with matching funds, but that has always seemed to be extremely unpopular with voters. I was wondering if you could comment on the possibilities, the advantages, the disadvantages of public funding?
Well, I mean, part of the problem is there are different models. I'm not so sure it's always extremely unpopular with voters. We've seemed to have had pretty good experience with it in Maine since 1996, where we have public funding for our state elections. But I think that, part of the issue with public funding was, number one, the original model was designed to say, let's provide, some sort of public subsidy to candidates to try to make it easier for people to run. And in doing so, many embraced public funding because after the Buckley decision, the Supreme Court said, well, the only way you're allowed to limit expenditures is if you have public funding. So they saw it more as a vehicle for limiting expenditures. I tend to support more models of public funding that are designed to expand citizen participation, get more people in the game, try to generate more small contributions. So that, I have been an advocate of approaches like the New York City system or the system they're now using in Los Angeles, or a system now that they're looking at in a couple of other cities where you provide some sort of a multiple match on small contributions to give donors more of an incentive to give a small contribution and therefore provide candidates with funding that way. I think that the evidence is pretty compelling out of New York City that this type of approach has expanded the types of candidates who run. It's had a remarkable effect in increasing the demographics of the people who give, and it has helped to provide candidates with the option of running, particularly for those such as women candidates, candidates from minority communities who don't have access to wealthy donors, so that models that kind of are based on civic participation is one of the things I think are worth exploring, and we're seeing some pretty good experiments with that now.
Would you like to comment on that, Jim?
Well, we have a public funding system right now, and that's for people running for president. But the last person that took it was McCain, and he had 2 months to spend it, and it was $84 million. And since there's no fundraising cost, that was probably worth maybe 120 or 30 million. If you had to raise it, that would be your budget. And of course, nobody in their right mind that is taking public funding now, or will, either for the primary or for the general. And that is because of the fatal flaw that you, Tony, I think mentioned, is that the people who, the primary motivation, it seems, because it's not me, but it just seems from what they propose, is to limit spending. And, you know, in other words, the government is not going to give you enough. And what that means is people, while some may, like marginal candidates, non-viable candidates, things like that, people like Lyndon LaRouche, who kept running for president, even though he was in jail, he's getting public money and for running for president. But it's just not viable because you don't get enough, so the candidates that are really competitive and a viable candidate just won't participate.
Yeah.
And they'd be absolutely insane to participate.
Yeah, actually, I would argue that with respect to the presidential system, that for the most part, the system worked fairly well through the first 4 or 5 elections. But then, you know, Congress never took any action to adjust the program to the changing realities of the presidential system, particularly the fact that the presidential system became more financially demanding as the process became more and more compact. Some of you in this room remember when you used to vote in the primary in March, before it became late February, before it became early February, before it became late January, right? And I think that that was one of the problems, that eventually you started this disconnect between the realistic costs and what you could really get from the public funding. And so it was basically allowed to engage in planned obsolescence. And one of the changes that we have seen that I didn't include in my litany of horrors is the fact that since the last election, the Congress has eliminated the funding for conventions that used to be provided, which is one of the rationales for giving the parties more ability to raise large contributions, because now they have to replace the convention money they used to get from the public funding. And I think Jim is right that given the realities of the presidential system now, you know, it's really no longer an issue. And there's actually a bill in the House right now to eliminate the program altogether. I decided that the presidential campaign public funding system had reached kind of its nadir when I looked last election and saw that the Libertarian candidate was taking public funding, okay, and was one of the only candidates to take it. And I am sure
I missed that.
you
Oh,
might
wow.
remember more than me, Jim, but I am sure that when I started studying this, the Libertarians were very opposed to using
Yeah.
tax dollars for campaigns.
They
That's how
sued.
close they were.
They sued the public funding
Yes,
system.
yes. Well, last election, they took what they once thought wasn't that great an idea.
But I think what you point out, though, is an inherent problem with a government program. Is you know, they're not usually passed with the kind of reality adjustments that the market automatically does every single moment. You know, the market is constantly adjusting every moment to the realities of the situation. Government programs are just locked in. 5 years later, you know, they make no sense. And then one party or the other says, well, this advantages me to keep it the way it is. Or whatever rationale they use, or they're too busy doing something else or whatever. And so this is just inherent in relying upon the government to fashion some sort of way to run campaigns or finance campaigns. What would happen when, you know, the Supreme Court struck it down in Buckley? What would happen if it was mandatory? It could have been mandatory, that they are required to participate in public funding campaign. Right now they'd be spending $20 million. That's insanity. But that's the problem with the government. That's my fundamental problem with public funding, is it is a government from the top engineered, you know, trying to adjust the market, you know, trying to quote, fix the market somehow. And you end up with all these inequalities and problems, and so many of these programs just collapse and never benefit the people they were supposed to benefit. I will say I am in favor of one thing that would help small contributions. I am in favor of tax credits, and you remember we had those. Yeah, and we had those. I think it was with the Watergate amendments, post-Watergate amendments, and it was you got a tax credit of half of your $200 at the time, which is pretty much, 30, 40 years ago is a lot of money, and was a tax credit. And I don't think there's any question that I'd encourage people to small donors. And, that's the kind of, it doesn't really, do much to the market, affect the market in the way these other things do, but would be an encouragement. I could go for something like that, I think.
We have about 20 minutes left, so we'll entertain questions. I'd ask two things. First, get a microphone. And second, keep your question short. Try to keep it as a question. So we'll have time for a number of people. Yes, sir. Right.
Good evening. My name's Rick Hubbard, and I drove all the way over from South Burlington, Vermont tonight because this issue is important. The state of our democracy, whether it's working as our founders in forming the Constitution, is important. And I'm struck by something, and I don't know quite how to explain it or who to direct it to, but what strikes me is that we have spent the entire evening today talking about the money that is coming from the roughly 4% or less who give it, and we haven't spent any real time talking about how the state of our democracy speaks for the interests of the 96% of us that don't give a dime directly to any political candidate or political party in the federal election. Where is the speaker and the platform that is going to talk about the reasons that we founded our country? My understanding is that had a lot to do with seeking, it was over improper representation that we broke from Great Britain. And our founders were very sensitive to this issue in forming our Constitution. So they wanted, as Madison explained it, a government that was dependent on the people through direct elections, especially with the House of Representatives. We fudged it on the Senate until early 1900s. Where's the speaker who's talking about the fact that our dependence today is not on the voters directly? It has become distorted. There is a dual dependence today. You must have the money. And if you don't have the money, or in order to get it, candidates lean to the green. It's distorting outcomes on law, regulation, and policy, and working very much against the interests of the 96% of us. We know it in polls. But I'd like to hear some discussion in a much broader context about the state of the democracy, because the money and the way it has been influencing our political system, most people have documented has been in real trouble, not for the last 5 or 6 years, but you can go back 20 or 30. And I apologize for being so negative, but I'd love to hear a slightly broader perspective here.
I think the problem is you prepared that speech before you came here and listened to the panel. Because, oh yes.
Let me just kind of, we've had a question. I want Jim is responding. I'll give you a chance to ask your question.
Thank you. Because I talked about the founding of our country. I talked about how our system was organized, of self-government. I talked about the First Amendment and the role that the First Amendment played. And I talked about the distortion that campaign finance creates in our system. So everything that he's talked about, I talked about. Okay, maybe not in the way that he did, but I think faithful to our history and what occurred and what it all meant. Now, I would add one other thing, which you hear often in these debates. It's the 1% versus the 99%, or 6% versus the 94%, or it's the wealthy, versus everybody else. There are countries in the world where that is a true statement. In other words, you have, landed aristocracies, okay, or you have in the feudal system, you have, the people that own the land, and you have the serfs. But we created a country that we wouldn't have that people would be able to move up in the world and go from, as every presidential candidate tells you, a house without a floor, you know, an outside toilet, and then before you know it, they run for president. And so we have a different kind of country, and so the result is that the rich are on both sides. They don't have a peculiar interest the way the feudal landlords had in the feudal system. We have rich people on both sides, and in fact, there are more wealthy people on the liberal side, the progressive side, than there are on the conservative side. The top 20 donors to campaigns last time, 12 gave exclusively to Democrats. Of the 10 congressional districts with the highest per capita income, of those 10, 8 are represented by Democrats, liberal, progressive, socialist, in some cases, Democrats, the kind of people you like. It's the rich people that are voting for these people, all right? In other words, what you have is a very kind of odd situation. You have the really wealthy, the 1%, are predominantly liberal and Democrat, and the people under 50,000 are prominently liberal and Democrat. And the great middle is predominantly conservative and Republican. And so, but even with that, I'm not going around saying, well, they can't participate either, even with that reality in mind, that they're going to make more money, their campaigns are going to get more money if people can contribute freely, because there's no systematic effect, because there are rich people and poor people and middle people and on both sides of the spectrum. For every Coke, there's a Steyr, and what effect does it have, on the system, Well, nothing, really. I mean, people are on both sides of the aisle.
I tend to think that it does have a big effect on the system.
Yeah.
And,
I know.
oh, sorry.
I thought we had
Wow,
mics.
I'm usually not told to speak up.
Right.
Thank you.
It bears to tone his microphone is a little weaker.
I think that it does have a effect on the system, and I think that you're right in raising this issue. I mean, one of the things that we haven't talked enough about tonight is that while Jim likes to say Congress should make no law, the reality is that for a long time the courts, I mean, in the modern era, even with Buckley, has recognized very clearly that the First Amendment is not an absolute right. That freedom to political speech is also balanced with legitimate concerns the government has about corruption or the appearance of corruption. And I think that this is not a new idea. I mean, if you go back and you look at even the beginnings of our campaign finance laws, if you look at the original efforts at the beginning of the 20th century under the progressives to prohibit corporate contributions to candidates. If you look at the efforts in the late 19th century to stop assessments on individuals from part of their pay as a contribution to the party in exchange for jobs, this concern about the corrupting effect of money and the influence it may have on the system is a long-held concern that we have in our country. And one of the things that concerns me most is that what you have now is a system where we have gone from not just a member of Congress worrying about, well, if I cast this vote, am I going to lose a $5,000 contribution from this PAC, or might this be the case where I'll lose $10,000 in the next election cycle? But that's worth it to me because this is an important issue for my constituency, is that you now have members who have to think about not simply is this going to lead to the loss of a $5,000 contribution, but is this going to lead to $1 million campaign against me? And I think that that is a very different type of pressure and dynamic on the legislative process. And I think that if you have conversations with members of Congress, they tell you this is something they now worry about. So that one of the things you have to do is think about what the ramifications are in terms of the election. It also means that this works both ways. I think one of the problems that we have when we talk about this and we talk about the influence of money is that people too commonly see this as people trying to buy influence. And I think that's a legitimate concern. In fact, the only time I was involved in a Supreme Court case that won was in the McConnell case, where we were arguing that you should ban unlimited contributions to parties, and you should support McCain-Feingold, because large contributions buy access and they buy undue influence that may not reach the standard of bribery or corruption, but is a legitimate part of corruption. And in that regard, one of the things that's been going on in the last 5 years, particularly, is that we have shrunk the notion of what constitutes corruption. You know, Jim likes to give you the obvious one. Oh, here's a congressman who found money in their refrigerator. It's like, okay, yeah,
Freezer,
that
freezer.
Okay, that sounds corrupt. But you know, one of the things
Even
that
worse.
has always been that it's corruption and the appearance of corruption and what constitutes that. And one of the reasons why we've seen a lot of these court cases go against the law in the last few years is that with the shift in the Supreme Court and the Roberts Court, they have adopted a very, very, very narrow conception of corruption. That basically corruption is a quid pro quo exchange. Undue influence, buying access, even the appearance of corruption don't count. So that they've basically said if it's bribery, well, then we can regulate it. But that, I think is a much too narrow construction, especially in a democracy. And I think that that's one of the problems that we face that has triggered a lot of the concerns that I guess I was inarticulate but trying to raise by saying that if you look at all of the activity going on, one of the things that you see is that you're really dealing with, it doesn't matter which rabbit hole you're looking at. It's the same pool of people. It's the same 2,000 people who have lots of money, who are willing to give lots of money for political purposes. And I think that's problematic. I would much rather see a campaign finance system that's geared towards broadening participation, involving lots of small donors, so that you at least have, in some ways, a much more representative financial base for the financing of elections.
In order to be, go ahead.
Yeah, let me respond to two of those things. First is the history. Really, the history of our country is we spent 180 years, other than a couple of years with the Alien and Sedition Act and a couple of years with the Sedition Act in 1918, without any campaign finance regulation up until 1974.
No, there was regulations starting in the
There were no
post-Civil War.
contribution limits. There were no expenditure limits.
Yeah, there were.
No, there weren't. In the federal system,
1925 Corrupt Practices Act.
but were there contribution limits?
1907.
Were there
prohibition.
contribution
Yes.
limits? No, there weren't.
Yes, there were.
On federal candidate?
There were contribution limits on federal party committees.
Oh, wow. I said on federal candidates, were there contribution
Well, at the
limits?
time, it was the parties that were financing the campaigns, and there were contributions on national party committees.
Okay, so there were no, so
Contribution
my answer to my question was, no, there were not any contribution limits on candidates, and that was my point. That there were no contribution limits on candidates, that is what I've been addressing, tonight as the principal problem. And so there was nothing comparable to the regulations that began in 1974. And so we've had 40 years of this experiment out of our, 220 years of history. And that's really not, it's not fair to say this is, what we've been thinking for all these years. Now, it is true that the founders understood that government, that politicians would use the government to restrict the participation of citizens in campaigns if they could. And that's the reason they had the First Amendment, which was very vigorously applied throughout our history until really the Buckley Court upholding contribution limits. And so that started this experiment that we've been on. And I just can't imagine anybody saying right now that our system is better than something else. I mean, we can't follow the money. There's little accountability, little transparency. Our candidates are marginalized. And the rich people that you're complaining about, you know, are going wild. Is that what I caused? No. I was against all these damn laws, okay, that caused this system. There is right now a premium on going to raise big contributions into super PACs and things like that would not exist if it was going to candidates. You distorted the system and caused more harm that you identify as harm, what you consider to be harm, is being caused by the system that you partially defended. Partially defended.
I will
Okay.
I will definitely defend. I will defend contribution limits.
Okay.
I will definitely.
Don't you
defend
think they should be
contribution
higher?
limits. I do think they should.
How
be
much higher?
It's hard to tell, but I would say that, you know, they should be significantly higher than they are now. I mean, if they had just been adjusted for inflation, they would be much higher than they are now.
True enough.
Similarly, I think that the thresholds for disclosure should be much higher than they are
Mm-hmm.
now, but they should be much broader and fully enforced.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one of the problems that we have had that's been a big change is that, you know, it used to be the case that everyone agreed on disclosure. You know, even before you got into the period of starting debate about McCain-Feingold, you know, Congressman Doolittle and Congressman DeLay always used to say all we need is disclosure. But now that has broken down. You know, there's no longer any real push in the Republican Party for having any more kind of disclosure, because they would much prefer to have the money hidden away, so that, you know, the disclosure efforts have gone for naught recently.
Actually, the reason is our position has always been that we are in favor of disclosure for direct political activity and for political actors. So we're in favor of disclosure for independent expenditures. We weren't for election and communications because we thought that took up too much issue ads. But for independent expenditures, yes. For candidates, PACs, political expenditures for elections of political parties. And so the debate has not been over, are you in favor of disclosure or not, but who is disclosed what? And so really the disagreement is when you get to the point of broader, okay? That's where the disagreement is. Not whether or not they should be disclosure, it's who and what, okay? Yours is broader, and I don't fully know your position, but if I take some other people's position and say they want like C4s to be fully disclose all their contributors. Well, C4 is an advocacy group, it's a lobby group, it's a Sierra Club. Most of their activity, or they would have to disclose all their donors. Most of their activity is lobbying and education. So it's not related to an election.
Right.
Okay? So what would be the reason to have donors who give money for a charitable purpose or to lobby to disclose as if they're giving it for a political campaign? They're not. Okay? So I don't think that disclosure makes any sense. It's not disclosing campaign activity, it's disclosing non-campaign activity. And that's where we should take the lesson from NAACP versus Alabama, because the NAACP in Alabama was doing a boycott of the white businesses in the late 1940s. And they were doing a boycott in Birmingham. The reaction to that was the state demanded the membership list of the NAACP that was doing the boycott. Now, come on, what do you think they wanted that for? You know, it's perfectly obvious. They were going to get those people, you know, and just demanding it, they thought would probably inhibit the activity of the NAACP, which it surely would have to disclose to those people that they were associated with the NAACP.
So I do want to make sure we get to a couple more questions.
So in other words, that's the kind of disclosure, in the area of disclosure that people are advocating is for that to be disclosed. Well, I think that's where the NAACP comes in.
I've actually would like to get 2 questions in. We're running out of time, so I suggest if you could make your question, and then we'll go to
done?
this gentleman over here, and then we can respond to both
Okay,
of the
thanks.
questions.
In the last congressional election, I believe about 33% of the registered voters actually turned out. I think that says a lot about our system, that people don't have much confidence in it. And so many people I know believe we have no longer a government of, by, and for the people, but of, by, and for the corporations. And you mentioned it, they're lobbyists, and that's problematic. Now, remember in 1961, President Eisenhower warned us about the growing power and influence of the military-industrial complex. And that also, I believe, is problematic. So what specific steps might you think or recommend be taken to break, I believe, and maybe a lot of people here as well, the stranglehold of our corporations upon our government and their lobbyists in terms of our democracy and the money? I mean, there are corporations, Lockheed Martin, that takes contracts, government money, uses that money, siphons it off to their lobbyists to obtain more contracts without any bid. So anyway, that's my question. What steps might you recommend to help break the stranglehold of these corporations and the money they contribute?
Actually, why don't you tackle that, and then we'll go to
Okay.
the final question will be over this.
We need to move power down, lower in the governmental system. And I agree. I'm very cynical about the government, and that's why I would never ever allow them to have the power to regulate my speech, because I don't trust them. And that's what just boggles my mind. People are so critical, as you have been, of the government and not trusting them and believing that they are handmaidens to corporations, but you are simultaneously prepared to give your freedoms to the government to regulate.
I want my freedom back.
Yeah, well,
We have one more
it won't be
question over here.
campaign finance reform, but people generally are rational. They are willing to, on your point about participation, because that is a serious problem also. People are generally rational. They will spend their time on things that they can affect. They tend not to spend their time on things they cannot affect. So there are a lot of people that make a rational decision and say that my vote I'm concerned about the environment, but it's the federal government that does that, and that's all the votes of 300 million people. And you know what? How can I affect that? I mean, how can my vote affect that? If that power was down in your town, all right, boy, now your vote, wow, can really affect the very issue that you're concerned about. So one of the dynamics that is going on is we're ceding power, shoveling power up to the federal government, and as a result, people rationally know that their ability to affect that government is much less than their state or their town, and so they tend to participate less. That's it. That's a big reason.
I didn't, is this on? Yep.
Yes.
I came from the next town over, Bedford. My name is Frank Zito. Jim, I think you mistake money for speech, and the two are not equal. And that's the flaw in the Citizens United. The Koch brothers, Charlie and David, have already announced they're committing $989 million to the upcoming election. So what I think is happening is we are losing our democracy to the oligarchs. Because none of us in here, I certainly can't contribute $200,000 or $300,000 or $10 million. And as you said, Tony, only 2,000 people made the majority of the contributions. We're losing our democracy. We forget the fact all this money that's spent, WMUR, which you mentioned, all these local television owners, the network owners, they rub their hands with glee at the thought of another campaign coming up. We as Americans own the airwaves, don't we? We own the rights to the licenses for the cable companies, but nobody ever says to them, folks, you're going to have to give 60 days or 90 days, cut your rates 80, 90, 95% during that time, so much time for each candidate. our former senator here, John Sununu, and I had a conversation one day at the Bedfordtown meeting, and he told me one of the biggest lies I've ever heard a politician say. When I said, John, I don't give you a lot of money. I don't have it to give. But I suppose if I gave you $1 million when I called next week, you'd see me pretty quickly in your Washington office. He said, Frank, whether you give me $10 or $1 million, I'll answer your call as quickly as the person that gives $1 million. And I know that's nonsense, and I told him at the time, I didn't say you're a liar, John, but I said, John, you're not telling me the truth. You know, that's a lot of baloney. But we are losing our democracy to big money, and Citizens United is a primary cause for that. I'd like to see all campaign contributions completely outlawed, not a penny given, and every American pay $20 a year. That would be $6 billion going into a kitty. In 4 years, that's $24 billion. And that money could be used by candidates who want to run for office, who have reasonable, legitimate points to make and sound like they're semi-intelligent. But we're losing our democracy to big money, and most of us have little or no voice. Yeah. And I expect to see pretty soon we'll hear that, oh, by the way, Communist China just gave $1 billion or $2 billion to some committee, some campaign. It won't be disclosed for a while, but eventually we'll hear money coming from foreign governments as well.
Mm-hmm. We're also starting to lose our audience. So if we get a brief comment from the panelists, and then we'll adjourn to more informal discussion.
The only thing I'll talk about is the money and speech issue, because. You know, I think they've done a great job putting this on. I don't know why you guys are so critical of it.
I will bet that anyone who wants to stick around and submit questions to the speakers, they'd be happy to do so for a while. Our position is not money is speech.
What our position is that if you regulate money that is spent on speech, you're regulating speech. And there was a very simple explanation of that in the Buckley decision in '76 in a footnote. And it said that we have a right to travel. If you limited how much money you could spend on gas, well, then you'd be limiting travel, right? Because you got to have gas to run your car to travel. So if you're limiting how much money you can spend on gas, you're limiting the travel you can do. The same if speech takes money to go beyond the person you can reach with your own voice. And somebody had to buy the soapbox, somebody bought the megaphone, and somebody has to pay for the ad, and that all takes money. If you limit what you can spend on speech, you're limiting speech, that's all. So it's a very logical. I'm sorry, can you give him a mic? I can't hear him.
Let me suggest this. We're past the time. I want to give Tony a chance to respond, and then why don't you direct your question to Jim later.
Well, I think that, I would agree with Jim about the argument that's made that money is not directly speech, it is a requisite of facilitating speech. But I think it's also the case that, as the court noted, for the most part, the act of making a contribution is an act of political speech, because it tells you, here's the candidate you support. And whether you give $10 or $100,000 doesn't give you any more information about that speech, and therefore they said that's why we can regulate campaign contributions, that the speech value of the contribution is different than when you have someone personally spending their own money independently, because then it's their speech. But in terms of giving money to a candidate, the candidate then decides what to do with that, and therefore the court said, given the interest in safeguarding the system against corruption, that we can place more stringent requirements on campaign contributions. So I think that, even if you take this conception of money and its relation to speech, it shows why campaign contributions are something that we can do in a democracy, and I think it's something that's an important safeguard in this democracy that we have lost in recent years and need to find some way to restore.
Well, thank you very much for coming, and thanks.